Oh, no, never done. Several clergy
Was the Pope appealing for peace, or was he praying for peace?
And the same applies to the carry-on drag.
Yeah, that's a good question. So what do you have to say about that, guys? Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to the latest edition of Global Atheist News Review. This is the bit where we take the news that was transmitted, live streamed last night, and we take it apart. We give our views on the news, and I have a panel of opinionated people to help me do that. So, welcome, Dr. Ty Wells.
Hey, what's up? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Okay, just give me a second to set that up. I got a steak cooking.
Welcome, Guy Otten.
Hiya.
I should say that Ty is in, I can never remember whether it's Tennessee or Kentucky. I think
sometimes I forget too. It's in Tennessee though.
Yeah. Okay. Guy is in the northern part of the UK. Tersia is also in the UK today, unusually, because she's on holiday here. Normally, she's a South African resident. Mm-hmm. And David is from New York. And Frank is in Kentucky. He's a Louisville or thereabouts resident. So welcome, guys. Thank you very much for joining us to take the lid off the latest religious news. And we're going to start with the Archbishop of Canterbury, because he is holding, it's called the Lambeth Conference, but it's located in Canterbury. And it's the first one in 14 years. I think it's the first one to be in Canterbury in 14 years. And they have a series of what's called calls. We would call them motions, ideas that are brought to be discussed to a conference. And the ones that are thrown up for this at the last minute for this conference have upset the apple cart. The Archbishop has been forced into a last minute rethink because a bishop who is the Bishop of Jamaica, name of Howard Gregory, has put up a call that calls for the reaffirmation of a position that upholds marriage as between a man and a woman, and that legitimizing or blessing of same-sex unions cannot be advised, and that it is the mind of the Anglican Communion as a whole that same-gender marriage is not permissible. Now, what's happened here is they bounced this onto the conference at the last minute because the Bishop of Los Angeles, the Right Reverend John H. Taylor, was among those aghast at the call, and he's warned that the conference was on course to register support for a position that divides, hurts, scapegoats, and denies. And one of the bishops, oh no, it's him, the same one, he said he was shocked and dismayed about what has been called the human dignity call. And he's a gay man married to another man, and his understanding and experience of human dignity includes the blessing of two people joined together in holy marriage, regardless of gender. Now, he didn't know about this. Oh, no, that's another one. A bishop in Toronto didn't know about this was going to happen because he was in meetings discussing the early stages of the agenda at the conference, and nobody told him in the early drafts that this was going to happen. So
I think it's worth mentioning, John, that this Lambeth Conference is essentially the Anglican Church's sort of decision making, if you like, or unifying body. I think they're all pretty much independent, but it tries to bring them together.
Yes.
And the Anglican Communion, I think they call themselves, have
Yes.
actually been split for quite a few years over this gay issue, and this is another example of that.
Yes. And the Archbishop has been trying to heal this wound ever since he was appointed.
Well, I think that some African Anglican dioceses have actually declined even to attend the conference because they're so rigidly against any concession to gay equality.
And it's really, really, in my opinion, shooting themselves in the foot, because who else has money and willingness to spend it than couples without kids? And I'm just thinking, like, it's a great market. It's almost to the point where it's like, why don't we just make a religion just for gay dads and be like, hey, our holy son, and then you just give us money for it. It's like, it's right there, guys. Come on.
Yeah.
But Ty, if you know your scriptures, and if the scripture is your guidance, then even if you're a gay man or a gay woman, I'm really sorry, but I can't see how you cannot interpret scripture as having a very strong view on homosexuality being an abomination, is the word that's used. And I actually find it a little bit incomprehensible that gay people can't see that. Why don't they just ditch the whole book and the church and doctrine with it? So I have to. In South Africa, this issue is actually leading towards a split in the Dutch Reformed Church, because there's also these two strong factions. And my opinion on the matter, there was a court case in South Africa. It went all the way to the High Court because the church decided to accept gay marriage, and then it was overturned, and then they were taken to court by some other members of the church leadership, and long story. But I really, if you want to be sincere about reading and interpreting the Bible, then I can't see how you can harmonize homosexuality and the text. So I feel really sorry for any homosexual people who want to remain Christian, and because in that sense, the Bible says it's wrong.
Yeah.
One last highlight. The beautiful thing about the Bible is it's not written on any sort of consistent rationale. So in places where you have homosexuality as a sin, you have just as many, perhaps even more, genuinely vague verses where it's God loves everyone and everyone's God's children. And therefore, you can have people in the Pride Parade on the sides protesting the gay people, and in the parade supporting gay people for God on both sides. I think that's brilliant of Christianity.
Well, that's that's the subjective nature of organized or disorganized religion. Religion was used to enforce slavery, and it was also used as a catalyst for some people who were religious to be abolitionists. It's a Rorschach test ultimately, but it has social and political consequences.
Yeah. This is no time to mention the Westboro Baptist Church, is it?
Let's not mention them.
No.
Sorry. You can mention them because they are the best depiction of what the Bible actually literally represents, because they cite everything that they argue on their posters. So we groan, but we should, if anything, put them on a pedestal because they're the most accurate representation of what Christianity honestly is.
Yeah, but surely, Ty, they are also an extreme representation, because actually most Christians cherry pick one thing or another out of the Bible to arrive at whatever position they're at.
I agree completely. Also, have we not noticed that Christianity is the book where everyone in the world drowns by the God in the very first chapter, and there's lions, and there's God telling guys to sacrifice their sons? It's an extreme religion.
It is
Let them be represented by an extreme group.
Yeah.
It's a death cult.
We've got a genocidal God. Nobody seems to be bothered with that.
Just as long as we all consider them as a punchline, I think that's the point. It's when we take them seriously that's the problem. So, like, put them on a pedestal.
Well, I can give you a spoiler alert for next week's news, because an item came to my attention after we'd gone to press for this week's Global Atheist News concerning one Ted Haggard, who you may remember. Historically, he was a seriously anti-homosexual preacher until he was caught in flagrante delicando with a male prostitute. And this, you remember that?
It's always the way, isn't it? I mean, the more vociferous they are, or you can almost put money on them being found out at some point as closet gays.
It seems to be the case. Anyway, I don't want to go into that because it's next week's news, really. But he's been caught at it again. So, our Canadian correspondent, who can't make it tonight, Dread Pirate, DP Higgs, we call him now. He's got a marriage to preside over. He's conducting a marriage, so he can't make it today. But he reported an item of news from Canada concerning his popeliness, who visited the Cree Nation lands to pray at a ceremony. And 4 Cree chiefs escorted him in his wheelchair to powwow at the ceremonial grounds, where he delivered an apology and was given a feathered headdress for the way that Christians historically had been involved in what he described as the colonizing mentality of the times, in which 150,000 children were forced to attend state-funded Christian schools from the 19th century until the 1970s in an effort to isolate them from the influence of their homes and cultures. What do you think of that?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's good news that these horrors are being recognized by the various institutions, including the government. And in fact, in Britain, we understand and have understood for a while now, that colonization involved a lot of horrors. And, that's the reality.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Isn't it? What about his apology, though? Is that adequate, or what? Is it late? What do you think?
Yeah.
Well, insofar as apologies go, that it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change the past. It doesn't take away the horror. But maybe it sets an example for what not to do in the future. And if that's all you can do, then I suppose it's a bit like white people in South Africa apologizing for the horrors of apartheid. And as a person who has never contributed, but by my lineage has been benefited by apartheid, as long as they understand, as long as the Catholic Church and the Christians understand that they will have to continue to apologize. Because you can apologize as much as you want to for any wrongdoing, but you can't force the other person to accept the apology or to not be resentful. So as long as they know that apologizing doesn't change anything, and you have to still bear the consequences of the wrongdoing that you perpetrated, or even your ancestors perpetrated, because and I feel that I can say that as somebody who is part of a culture who perpetrated horrific deeds against Native people in my own country. And I think there's a lot of similarity, and coming from, I'm on the side. So
we welcome his apology, but there's been no reparation offer.
Right.
Well, and another thing to consider, really, an apology is an admission of guilt. you know, it has that value, even though it's not explicit that way.
Yeah.
But really, that's about all an apology in a case like this is. At least it's an acknowledgement of we were wrong.
Yeah.
It's also in some ways a glimmer of hope that what was wrong will never happen again, or at least it's a change of course. I like to think of it as like if I'm in a really bad sea and the storm is coming towards us and and waves are quite high, I can turn that wheel in a very sharp direction back towards the shore, but my ship may not immediately go there. But I have made the intention to try to change course. And I think it's that intentionality that people who are in a hopeless situation are looking for, because that's how we can curb culture towards more progressive attituts.
I have to take a more pessimistic view. I think this is while the Pope may or may not be sincere, I think this is a way of bulwarking against a possible class action lawsuit in the same vein that was done against the church for all the sexual abuse in the United States and in Europe and other places. So, I think it's part sincere apology, but I think it's also very much so public relations campaign.
Yeah. Well, it was certainly groveling. Listen to what he says. With shame and unambiguously, I humbly beg forgiveness for the evil committed by so many Christians against the indigenous peoples. But so you think he might just be covering his holy ass?
Well, I think he's trying. I think he's trying. I think he's trying to, stave off the inevitable, which is But I think there's talk about this Pope retiring soon, and who knows who the next, Christ on earth it will be, and whether or not he'll be a Jesuit and be more liberal, or will be more conservative and turn back, the clock, if you will.
Well, unfortunately, the clock does go both ways, unlike, the real cosmic clock.
Yeah.
So moving on then, we've got this week's delightful America item. And this reports a certain Matt Gaetz, who is a Republican in Florida. And he's been speaking to the Turning Point USA's Student Action Summit in Tampa. And he got huge laughs and applause from the crowd when he said, or he asked the question, why is it that the women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions? Nobody wants to impregnate you if you look like a thumb.
Yeah, didn't George Carlin make a similar sort of statement? Although I think from the other angle.
Absolutely,
this is just abuse. It's neither here nor there. It's fluff and trivia, but it is abuse, and shouldn't really be highlighted, I don't think.
Popular abuse at the meeting.
I was initially thinking of really why even comment on something like that.
Yeah.
What is worrying about that is that it really sharpens the divide, and it's really in a very visceral way painting the other side as not human, subhuman, and that's really, really dangerous.
I agree.
And I think if we look back in history, the first step in creating the path for severe violence against what you see as the other is dehumanizing them, and that's a very visceral way. And the fact that he got so much support just opens a path that makes me very concerned for the United States.
Yes. Well, he was underlining misogyny, in my view, and he it's not the first time, because previously he said, how many of the women rallying against overturning Roe are overeducated, underloved millennials who sadly return from protests to a lonely microwave dinner with their cats and no Bumble matches? So he's obviously got...
This is the same guy who's been on trial, or at least accused of sexual abuse against minors. So,
Yes. Oh, right.
you know, you're not talking about anyone with
Yes.
any
Yes.
intellectual worth
No.
going forward. It's just he's as bad as any virus.
You
But it's-
reminded me. He only thinks if women are over 15, they're not worth chatting. They're not worth lining up as potential partners. Over 15. Yeah.
But John, I also want to say it's not only misogyny of the worst kind. It's more than that, because any man who supports a woman who to stand up and speak for bodily autonomy will be labeled even worse than these so-called unattractive women. So it's really insidious, because I can just see how he doesn't even regard men who support pro-choice as being worth mentioning, because I think they're even lower scum than the women who support who want pro-choice. So I can only repeat, it makes me really worried about the United States and what's happening.
Yeah. Well, we're going to leave the United States alone for a few minutes. You'll be pleased to hear, because we're going to go to Egypt, where there's
May I get a point real quick? Just one.
Okay.
Sorry, one point.
Sure.
My mom has a saying that I think is worth mentioning, because there's another point that we're missing that I find nuanced and also deeply tragic. And my mom's deaf, so she comes from a deaf community, but she says, like, when elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. That's a really common phrase in deaf community. And the idea is we have two large political parties in the United States that could, in an ideal world, both be interested in the quality of life of people. However, we've lost that because now they've become so self-absorbed in this fight against themselves, and so polarized to the point where there's just clearly a progressive side and the opposite side. It's like, why do you need to be opposite to progressive? That's a good thing. I got to be the opposite of you because I'm paid to argue against you. And it's like, well, that's deeply in disinterest to the values and needs of the people right now. It's like, I don't care. I'm trying to get a job. I got to feed my family. It's like, well, this system is no longer in the service of the people. And women are going to suffer. Marginalized people are going to suffer. Poor people will suffer. And they are suffering now. And we see that. And I feel like we could have had a system where both parties were working together to build a better union. We never had that in the United States. In fact, it was always propagated on the interests of very few demographics against the many. But we are working our way towards that. And I want to just remind ourselves that when there's outrage now for things like that, and it's not just something that we sweep under the rug, that's a good sign, because that is the challenge that causes change. And there won't be change without a challenge. So I'd say continue to be upset about it, continue to be unrest about it. And if you're in the United States and you listen to this, vote. And if you're not in the US and you don't have an impact on here, make sure it doesn't happen in your country by making sure you speak up to matters like this. Don't let these opportunities go unnoticed.
Yeah.
Well, we're not that different in the UK, I'm afraid, but Europe is more enlightened. Mostly they have multi-party governments. So Egypt. There's a TikToker, name of Tala Safwan. She's got 5 million followers on TikTok and 800,000 on YouTube. And she does upbeat, catchy little TikToks concerning with pranks and challenges, like many successful teenage influencers around the world. But one of her recent videos has drawn a very different reaction. She's seen chatting to a female Saudi friend whom she invites over to her house. And her subsequent remarks have been interpreted by some as being sexually suggestive. So the police in Riyadh announced that they had arrested a local resident who appeared in a broadcast talking to another woman with sexual content and suggestiveness that could have a negative impact on public morality.
Well, they're probably right, because any young woman who in that society who has short hair and is funky and modern will probably have the effect of changing the society and making it more liberal and open. So they're right in that respect, but that's the only respect in which they're right, and their action is completely in line with their religion, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a freedom of speech issue here, isn't it?
Yes.
It seems to me that the restricting freedom of speech should really not happen, except in the most extreme circumstances, such as incitement to murder and things like this.
Yes.
Anything short of that, you're running huge political risks that you're going to end up in a tyrannical regime, and of course that's where Saudi Arabia appears to be anyway. So
yes. Two women chatting is not hate speech, is it?
No. I mean, they may well be suggestive of things that others may regard as immoral, but the answer is not to arrest them. It's just to debate and clarify and oppose them in speech.
And get up to speed with the modern world too.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Ty, you coming in here?
Yeah, just a quick. I'd say there for any aspiring TikTokers or people with social media that they like to greatly expand in a short period of time. I just want to make a point. There's a big difference between having an audience and having a community. And an audience is largely invested in their own interests, and you are fitting into those interests. Whereas a community cares about you generally and wants to support you. And so when if you are in a particularly contentious political area and you build a massive following, note that is a power structure that's threatening some other power structure that might be part of your audience. Likewise, if you're just making fun at home and friends, you might say or do things that can have impacts on you based on whatever kind of culture you live in. But you can find a community that can support you. And I think drive home the idea that your community is the thing that you want to grow, not so much your audience.
I like that. I like that. That's something I can quote.
I'll drink to that, because after all, an audience is just people gawping, but a community are your friends.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so it's to the UK now, because there's a broadcaster here, Nicky Campbell, he's got a very high profile. He used to host a weekly TV show called The Big Question, in which a panel of people and an audience addressed the serious questions, many of them of a religious nature. And it was very broad brush. It had members of all the different sorts of interests there could be in this panel and audience. And it was a great show. It's been taken off, unfortunately, one of the economies of the BBC. But he's now got a radio show, and he has been bearing his soul, because it seems that he was badly beaten up by a teacher who was a leading light in the Scripture Union at his school. That's the Edinburgh Academy. And he's 61 now, but it stayed with him all his life. And his mother at the time took it as far as she could, and she got a groveling apology from the teacher of the the leading light in the Scripture Union, but that's as far as it went. She was stonewalled and it was hushed up, and those were different times, but it's still in his head, rankling with him. He witnessed other children being abused sexually by other members of staff, one of whom is now dead. And he's still in contact with some of his schoolmates, and they talk about this, and they discuss it with, oh dear, what can you say, with hatred as to what happened to them. It's a very sad story. And this all came to light because another podcaster is actually exploring the abuse in Britain's private schools, historic abuse. And his wife overheard this episode when the Edinburgh Academy was mentioned. And she drew his attention to it, and he didn't want to listen. Mm-hmm. But eventually he realized that he should. And he got in touch with the other broadcaster, whose name is Campbell. And this
Another
is
Campbell.
Oh yes. No, wait a minute. I'm mistaken there. It's not, his name wasn't Campbell. I don't know what his name was. Sorry, that's my mistake. But they've had a get together now, and there's a documentary being produced, and he had a little cry telling his live show audience all this that happened to him those many years ago. Horrible, isn't it?
I mean, I'm afraid that this was actually not uncommon in that era and before. I mean, I was at a Catholic boarding school in the 50s, and I suffered some, minor sexual inappropriate abuse by a teacher. Not something that's really bothered me, but that did happen, and I think a lot of it went on. In fact, I do recall another teacher actually being sacked, not the one who did something to me, but another one was actually sacked because he was found out for doing something.
Yeah.
I watched the talk that Nikki Campbell had. It was really gripping, and I can just hope that we can use this information to still improve on how society works and on what to do and what not to do, because in South Africa, corporal punishment is officially banned in schools, but everybody knows it still happens in many schools. And well, in South Africa, the cases of teenage girls being impregnated by their teachers, 16-year-old, it's horrific. And we just need to continue to speak out, and these stories need to be told, and hopefully things will get better, because I do sometimes wonder how much of it is still swept under the carpet. It's still happening in schools today, but if the teacher in question has a high enough status, then I know of cases where these things are hushed because the school doesn't want the distribute, and it can really destroy people's lives, and nobody should go through that.
It's the same as the reputation damaging incidents that have been revealed about the Roman Catholic Church, for example. It's a similar sort of thing, different organization, similar sort of thing. Yeah. Okay, so you'll be pleased to hear that representative from Colorado, Republican Lauren Boebert, has been at it again.
Yeah.
She has said that the same-sex marriage bill that passed the House last week undermined masculinity. She's opposed to marriage equality, and she was interviewed by a student DJ to do with this Student Action Summit that was being held in Tampa. And they agreed between them that opposing what they called homosexual marriage could be a signal boost for Republican candidates if handled correctly. What does that tell you about the Republican electorate?
Come on, Frank, I can't wait to hear you.
Well, I was a Republican for 30 years, up until last fall when I had enough.
We'll forgive you.
It's a joke as a party right now. It's delaminating like cheap plywood that's being soaked in a river. I mean, it's so sad. Folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene, and along with Bobart, are characters, characterizations. Really, I can hardly. The words I want to use, I wouldn't want to go out on the air.
No, we are a family show. Yeah.
But I don't even know. I can't make sense out of her statement. How would same-sex marriage undermine masculinity? I don't get that. Does it even make any sense?
And she's thinking of same-sex marriage as being man on man and not including lesbian marriage in that, I don't think.
But how does it undermine masculinity? Marriage is simply letting them pursue happiness the way they want to pursue it.
Yeah.
But whatever masculinity or femininity an individual may have is there in advance of this whole idea of, hey, he and I want to get married. It just doesn't even. It's like many things that Bobart says and Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's not even sensible.
No. So what do you think, David, about the idea of it being a boost in terms of electoral, in terms of the vote size from Republican supporters?
I don't think she's winning any converts, but I think all it does is cue and send out the right message for those who are so in the MAGA camp that they just suck it down like pablum.
Yeah,
and will it's meaningless to anybody else who isn't going to vote MAGA because it's so nonsensical. Frank, you're absolutely right. There's no connection to anything in terms of reality. But for those who are, going to vote Republican anyway and vote pro-nativist, that wing of the party, because there are Republicans who dislike that entirely.
Right.
But for those who are in the Bible Belt or in some parts of the West and in some parts of other parts of the country, it's going to be manna from heaven, but only to them, not to anybody else.
She's throwing red meat to the faithful, isn't she?
Yeah.
Ty, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah. Never, ever, ever, ever ask me why is someone being unreasonable, because tends to be the case, or why is someone using hate in this way? Because the aspect about being unreasonable is that you don't need a reason to be that way, and I can't reason it. But I can tell you this: hate may not need reason, but it does need a target. And if it doesn't have a target, that's when it falls apart. So when we look at hate, look at what's being targeted. Is it an easy group to target? Well, then if it's a group that can't speak up for themselves, it doesn't have a group that doesn't have a lot of money or a lot of political sway, or still building up the momentum in order to build rights for itself, that's a target. and that's an easy target, and that's why she's targeting. In my head, I'm not making a reason for it, but I am saying that there's a target there, and that is a coward move to do that. And so, don't guide yourself by hate. Don't follow those who follow hate, because when that target's gone, they're going to find something else.
Yeah.
It just
Absolutely.
is
Right.
Yeah. Guy.
Yeah, yes, I just think she's using the word masculinity in a rather restricted sense, because surely if two gays get together in terms of sexuality, they're both masculine. So they're both, that is seems to me a release and an increase of masculinity in that sense.
Yes. Double trouble. Yes.
Yeah. I had a weird thing that happened to me at work. I don't know how to phrase it, but I had a guy, old man who's definitely a Republican, and I had an old manager who makes it very clear that he's a Republican too, and they're having a private conversation that gets loud enough that draws other people in. And it was the idea of, would you, if there was a Super Bowl event for $100 million, would you, as a man, masculine man, have fellatio? Are you allowed to say that on this show? With another man for $100 million during a halftime? And they were like, I wouldn't do it for $100 million. And my manager's like, there's no way in the world I'd do it for $100 million. And I was like, call me halftime, because that's a lot of money. What the hell are you doing?
well, of course, there's a joke based on that, isn't there? Because Winston Churchill was sat at this dinner table with the great and the good, and sat next to him with this society actress. And she was the most beautiful thing. And of course, he was no looker. And he said to her, Madam, would you sleep with me for £1 million? And no, would you sleep with me? I'm going to ruin this, aren't I? Would you sleep with me for £1 million? And she said, well, for £1 million, I would. Yeah. So then he went on and said, okay, well, would you sleep with me for £1? And she said, well, who do you think I am? And he said, we've already established what you are, madam. We're just haggling about the price.
There's this Afrikaans joke in a similar vein, about this farmer, rich, very wealthy farmer, who had a very unattractive daughter. She was really ugly, and she couldn't find a husband. So eventually, he sort of got a guy, but he was very wealthy. So there was this Afrikaans boy who rocked up and agreed to marry her. And he just said to his new father-in-law, could he just please get it was in the old Boer Republic, the old Transvaal, the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republic. Could he just get a flag as a wedding gift? Well, all right. And then eventually, I'm also butchering this a little bit, but what it boils down to is that he covered his bride's face with the flag, and said he will just engage in his marital duties for volk and fatherland, for country, for king and country.
Yes.
It's almost the same.
The king and country. He's a loyalist, yes. So, guys, we've got a couple of lighter and even good news material items to deal with as we go out. The one is you remember about 8 years ago, 2014, some militant Boko Haram, these are Islamists, in northern Nigeria, northeastern Nigeria, a town called Chibok. I'm sorry that Esther isn't able to join us tonight to talk about this, but they seized 300 girls from a school back 8 years ago. And most of the victims have either been freed or escaped since then, but dozens of them remain unaccounted for. However, this week, 2 more of the female students that were abducted have been found, and they're now being looked after in safe accommodation, and they're being rehabilitated by the Nigerian government. But of course, they gave birth while in captivity, so they've now come along with 3 children. However, it's good news, isn't it, that some of these abducted girls are being released.
Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah. Finally, you'll like this. Father Matteo Bernasconi from the Archdiocese of Milan had planned to hold Sunday's ceremony among the trees by the beach in Crotone, southern Italy, because of the heat. He was looking for some shade and outside. And he'd just come back from a week-long summer camp for high school students, an anti-mafia organization had set up, but he failed to find shade from the searing heat, and a nearby family offered him the use of an inflatable mattress. So he took the mattress, the priest took the mattress into the water and pretended it was the
Altar.
that's the word, pretending it was the altar, and conducted a service with everyone, including himself, in swimsuits. The stinger is the local Catholic Archdiocese has called for liturgical decorum and respect because they disapproved of his seaside celebration.
you mean he got in trouble on account of that?
Yeah. He's under investigation by
No sense of humor. He had a sense of humor, I would suspect.
Yes.
The church has no sense of humor.
No.
I wonder if he would have gotten in trouble if he wore his full dress, if he adhered to the correct dress code. If he would have been in trouble then, or maybe it was the plastic inflatable. Maybe the tools of the trade shouldn't be in contact with something as mundane as plastic. You know.
No, who can tell? He
I
did,
love that story though.
I'm sure I've read somewhere of weddings taking place amongst nudists on the beach.
oh,
So some denominations apparently can cope
Yeah.
with this sort of thing.
probably
Well,
not.
not
the
south of France, not in the south of Italy, not the Italians.
Well,
Probably.
what's the difference between the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon in the Water?
On that note, guys, thank you very much for turning up.
Bye then.
Thank you.
See you again next
Cheers.
week. Bye-bye. Several clergy
Was the Pope appealing for peace, or was he praying for peace?
And the same applies to